Hello there and welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia. I'm Sue Windybank and it's really great to have your company. Today we'll be discussing China's increasingly hegemonic behaviour and the emergence of balancing coalitions like the Quad and AUKUS to shape a new multipolar balance of power in the Indo-Pacific that limits the prospect of Chinese hegemony. The United States is at the core of this balancing strategy because of its unique heft and network of allies. But there's no denying concerns about the sustainability of a strategy that seeks to balance a large and rising power, China, with the support of a distant power, America. Our guests are both leading strategic analysts from two countries that have been on the front line of China's revisionism and efforts to unilaterally change the status quo. The Philippines in the South China Sea, and India along the disputed land border with China in the Himalayas. C. Raja Mohan is a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He's also a regular columnist for Foreign Policy magazine and the Indian Express. In November last year, he authored the CIS paper Between Geography and History, Delhi and Canberra in Indo-Pacific Security. Raja, welcome to CIS.
Thank you for having me.
Renato Cruz De Castro is a professor at the International Studies Department at De La Salle University in Manila and an expert in Philippine-American relations. He's previously studied and worked in Japan, Washington and Hawaii. And he's the author of the recent CIS paper, The Philippines Caught Between Appeasing and Constraining China, How Australia Can Help Tip the Balance. Welcome to CIS, Renato.
It's a great honor to be given the chance to express my view in this webinar.
Roger, we'll start with you. You're a leading commentator on Indian foreign policy. Tell us, why does India see China as a threat?
We never used to see China as a threat, actually. If you go back to the 1950s, when a few countries in the world recognized China, the PRC, India was a great champion of China, making the case for China's recognition of its membership in the UN Security Council. So we were, in great romance with China in the 50s. Of course, that ended badly in the war in 62. But India, again, rekindled the romance in the 90s when India and China said, look, we're going to work together with two major Asian countries. In 30 years, it seemed to work well for India-China, expanding trade, calm on the border. The last 4 years have seen a series of military crises. Starting in 2013, there was a major military clash. 2014, 2017, and in 2020. And now we're still struggling to undo what's happened in 2020. So I think even for India, which has always been romantic about China, it's difficult to now sustain that we don't have a problem with China. And the problem is serious. And in fact, today, there is a recognition in Delhi that China poses the single biggest problem for India, not just in the Himalayas you talked about. We've had this standoff for nearly almost 2 years it'll be. And China is also trying to undermine India all along its neighborhood, in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, in Nepal. So I think the friction between India and China is growing, and there is a direct military standoff in the Himalayas, and we still some distance to go before we resolve that.
So India is feeling encircled by China. Renato, over to Manila. Tell us, how does China threaten the Philippines?
Well, we go back as early as history. China has always looked at Southeast Asia as its backyard. So it is sort from the Chinese perspective, Southeast Asia is China's Lebensraum, a living space, the maritime living space. So that's historically been the case. Southeast Asia, along with the Philippines, has experienced wave of Chinese migrations way back in the 16th century. Of course, going back in the 1960s, the Communist Party of China actively supported insurgencies in Southeast Asia. This is something that many Southeast Asian countries had forgotten. In the 1960s, during the time of Mao Zedong, China encouraged communist movements here. The longest standing communist insurgency is happening here in the Philippines, led by the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Armies. They were sponsored by China in the 1960s. They owed their allegiance, their ideological links with China under Mao Zedong and Lin Piao. So this is something, again, that Filipinos have forgotten. Now, going back into the 21st century, this, of course, has something to do with classic geopolitics. The Philippines is an archipelagic nation located between Southeast Asia and, of course, Northeast Asia. We are on the path of Chinese maritime expansion. Originally, the Philippine perspective that it was simply a matter of those islands in the Spratlys that Filipino forces occupied and the Chinese want to control. Later on, we have to take into account China's goal is control of the first island chain, not just the 9-dash line. And we are in the smack of the first island chain. So the long-term perspective, and this I've been telling the Filipinos, we don't want to exist as a democracy, an island of democracy in a lake controlled by China. China's goal is to have control of the second island chain, of course, from Japan going down to Guam. China wants to create a maritime buffer when it could prevent American naval forces from operating in the first island chain. And we are right in the middle of that, buffer zone that China intends to build in the next 25 years.
Roger, you mentioned the Himalayan border standoff. 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives. There was a huge outpouring of anger on the streets of India and political anger as well. Can you see relations recovering from this?
Not in the near future. I mean, I think, as you mentioned in the beginning, China, violating nearly 30 years of various agreements to keep peace on the border, sought to unilaterally change the territorial status quo. Now, India has pushed back, and India is saying, look, unless you restore the status quo that existed before April 2020, the relationship is not going to be normal. Because our Chinese friends say, oh, no, let's go with the rest of the relationship. The border issue, we can keep talking about it. So I think, like they do in the South China Sea, take what has happened is happened, so let's go back to normal. I think India is not ready for it. And I think India's pressure, counter-military pressure, I think has seen some movement on the Chinese side. Out of the 6 points of friction we've seen, in 3 areas, there's been a disengagement. So we're still negotiating about the other 3 points. But there's no de-escalation. Both we have almost 50,000 troops each facing off each other in this extraordinarily inhospitable environment. So I think India has taken a stand. No normality in the bilateral relations unless the territorial status quo is restored. Meanwhile, trade, of course, India has also tried to decouple a bit, but trade continues to grow because of the last 40 years of interdependence that has emerged. India's import dependence on China. Trade has actually grown in the last year. But I think that story is about India's past. I think India, in the longer term, is turning to the West and the Quad partners for its trade relationship. So my sense is we will go downhill from here between India and China. The question then becomes, can we manage this relationship rather than having any kind of partnership or a cooperation?
Let's turn to some news about the South China Sea, Renato. It has implications for what you were talking about, China's maritime expansionism. Last Friday, your Defence Minister confirmed that the Philippines will be the first country to buy the BrahMos anti-ship missiles from India in a deal worth over 500 Australian million. Now, will China think twice before trying to seize islands or features that are claimed by the Philippines? Tell us a bit more about this deal and what these missiles can do and how it fits into your external defence.
Well, it's part of the second phase of what is called the Armed Forces of the Philippines Modernization Program, which began during the administration of the late President Benigno Aquino, who really took a very strong stance vis-a-vis China in 2011. So fortunately, this administration has been gone south or has adopted a policy of appeasement vis-a-vis China, has continued this modernization program. Now, this is the second stage wherein the armed forces of the Philippines have to develop external defense capabilities, specifically, of course, building up the Air Force and the Navy, developing a limited deterrence capability, anti-access area denial capabilities, specifically against the People's Liberation Army's Navy in the South China Sea. So in a way, it is a positive move It is developing our own version of what China has been developing against the United States. You have land-based, short-range, intermediate range, short-range missiles that could pose as a threat to the ships of the People's Liberation Army's Navy, and to a certain degree, even to the Chinese Coast Guard. So yeah, that's part of the development of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And of course, you have to take into account that the Armed Forces of the Philippines, despite the appeasement policy of this administration, has always cast a wary eye against Chinese actions in the South China Sea. It's also acquiring 6 patrol craft from Australia, not just India.
But is the Philippine Navy and Coast Guard outnumbered and outgunned? I mean, I've read a recent report which estimated that just in the Spratly Island chain alone, there are some 300 Chinese maritime militia vessels operating, and that's before you count the Coast Guard or naval assets or fishing vessels. So can the Philippine Navy and Coast Guard Air Force control or defend the country's territorial waters?
We cannot, but we have no choice but to challenge China, which happened recently in Winston Reef, just last March. Fortunately, we got support from the United States, from Australia, and of course, Japan. The United States even sent a carrier battle group just to send a message that it was concerned about what was happening in Winston Reef, in particular, and the South China Sea in general. So at least this forced this government to take a strong position against China.
Of course, Philippines is a US ally. India is not. Australia is. The relationship between India and Australia has really blossomed, Raja, in recent years. Now, there have been many false dawns, but it does seem real this time. And it goes way beyond those old cliches about the 3 Cs, the curry, the cricket and the Commonwealth. Tell us why you think this time around this is going to be an enduring partnership.
You can thank the Chinese for partly. I mean, I think
the 4th C?
Yeah, so that we're looking beyond. Yeah, that's the 4th C. So I think historically, I think there's so much common between India and Australia, part of the empire, and there was so much of shared legacy. I think through the Cold War, I mean, I think India was on a different trajectory and Australia was on a different trajectory. And there was occasional friction on many regional or global issues. But I think since the end of the Cold War, we've seen 3 things that have happened. One, there is an expanding economic relationship as India become a more, after its reforms in the early 90s. Second, I think there is a larger Indian diaspora today in Australia, is the fastest growing diaspora in Australia. And third, I think India is today closer to the US than it has ever been before. So in that sense, India's deepening partnership with the US in the last 2 decades has, I think, changed the regional context and the international context for India and Australia to work together. And the gathering threat from China, at least 3 of us, Australia, Philippines and India have been made examples by China in the last few years of trying to unilaterally force certain solutions on them. But I think we've stood up. And my sense is India and Australia today, there's extraordinary comfort level between the 2 political classes. And my sense is we're going to see a lot more between India and Australia in the days ahead, especially in the Eastern Indian Ocean and on a whole range of other multilateral issues besides the Quad.
But let me put something to you that former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating said about India. He's a skeptic. India has been a founder of the non-aligned movement, has historically been allergic to alliances, having no desire whatsoever to put all its eggs into one basket, something it will never do. But here we are in Australia at the strategic casino, putting all our money on black, thinking the Indians will turn up for a major showdown with the Chinese. That's former Prime Minister Paul Keating, Raja.
Look, as an Indian, I shouldn't be criticizing an Australian Prime Minister, but I think he's got it dead wrong. I think his sense of history is wrong. If he thinks about the World War II, it was Indian troops and Australian troops were fighting together. If you go back even a little further, Indian and Australian troops were in Gallipoli. So I think it's where you want to, you'll find what you want. Through our history, none of our histories are, limited to last 40 years. So I think a deeper perspective. Even if you were historically adversaries, if Australia can make up with China, and now it's making up with Japan, whom it fought in the Second World War. So what is this argument that India was that before, therefore we're not going to do it? So I would say, do we have shared interests in a stable Asian region today? Those interests are real. And is India capable of, India doesn't have to show up at Australia. If it stands up against China in the Himalayas, in Indian Ocean, that itself will be of great favor to the other countries in the region. And there is a whole lot of diplomatic and other means. I don't think India expects Australian soldiers to show up in the Himalayas, nor is Australia expecting Indian ships to come and save them from the Chinese. So I think this is a very, very, very narrow and schematic view that Keating has presented, which I think is bereft of a sense of geography or of history or of strategy at this point.
Just one more follow-up quick question to that. When Prime Minister Modi came to power in 2014, he really energised the Indian foreign service bureaucracy and the diplomatic corps, all in the pursuit of India's great power ambitions. Will this momentum continue when he leaves office, do you think?
I think so. I mean, I think India is, slow to change, but once it changes, the changes stick for a long time. You can see that we still can't shake off the Soviet-Russian connection. So we take a long time to make friends, but we keep our friends. And I think it's really the institutional entanglement that has emerged. As I said, diaspora is going to be a big bridge. Trade and economic relationship is going to be a big bridge. And expanding security cooperation between the two establishments. And then we are part of now increasingly of regional groupings, which we were not before. The initial attempt after the Cold War in the Indian Ocean Rim Association, those did not really work. But today we're working much more closely. My sense is, irrespective of who rules India or even who rules Australia, I think the structures are come together, and my sense is this will only get deeper and deeper.
Speaking of elections and prime ministers, Renato, the Philippines go to the polls for national elections in May this year. The Philippines is now part of the US alliance network again, and the VFA has been restored. Will the elections consolidate this reset with the US? Is China a major factor in the campaign? And do you think Beijing is likely to interfere to promote its preferred candidates?
Well, the issue of the South China Sea, of course, is external. It's kind of too far for the people. The issue here is classic, bread and butter issue. Basically what you can deliver. But China will be involved in providing money, the same way as allegedly it provided money to President Duterte in 2015. Even President Duterte did not deny it when this issue was raised by former Secretary Albert Del Rosario, that Duterte got money from the Chinese. Duterte only said probably that money was channeled through the Filipino-Chinese community, and I have no knowledge of it. President Duterte did not deny it. So China would be active. China would be providing money. You need in any democracy, not just in the Philippines. Money matters, right? For your machinery to run, for advertisements, so forth and so on. And China is more than willing to provide you that money. China has the capability. China, of course, after its success in 2016, will do it the same. Nothing works like success. That for at least for the last 4 years, they had Duterte on their strings. Of course, things have changed since last year. But for about 4 years, since 2016, Duterte was simply parroting Chinese position. Fortunately, it changed last year.
Under Duterte, of course, the US alliance went through a very rough patch. He effectively tried to abrogate the visiting forces agreement so that US soldiers couldn't operate on Filipino soil. Now, last year, I think that was finally restored, and the Philippines came back to the US fold, the alliance system. Do you anticipate that the next president will consolidate that reset?
Depending on who will be elected. There's already signal that China has already given its blessing to its mandated candidate, who went to the Chinese embassy last year to commemorate the establishment of Philippine-China diplomatic relation in 1976. Of course, this was during a time of President Marcos. And of course, the person who got invited, who was also running for the presidency, happened to be the son of President Marcos. So there's an indication that China has already indicated who is, its preferred candidate. And this is also reflected in his statement when he was asked about what China is doing in the South China Sea. His answer is, China is so powerful, we cannot challenge China.
Let's turn from electoral politics to the big strategic game. The US has emphasised that its greatest assets are its network of alliances and strategic partners. Well, former Singaporean diplomat Kishore Mahbubani, who's been a past guest at CIS, has been really critical of this approach. He says the big strategic game in Asia isn't military, it's economic. And China's playing the long game by focusing on trade to tie countries to a Sino-centric system, and that's going to outlast America's short game with its focus on military alliances. Raja, does Kishore have a point? I mean, India walked out of the RCEP negotiations, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that includes China, and the US withdrew from the TPP that China has now applied to join. So neither India or the US are in either of the two big regional trade groupings. Kishore says this is a big geopolitical gift to Beijing. So why did Delhi stop short of joining RCEP?
I think for India, just like for the US, the interdependence with China, we see it as one-sided, that it is to the benefit of China. Unlike large parts of Southeast Asia, which are prepared to act as a complementary market for China, India wants to do its own thing. So it's just not simply, and India has its own class of capitalists who are not simply going to cede their market to the Chinese just because in the name of globalization. I think that is the backlash. It's not as much as the government, that the Indian capital says that, look, this is our capacity to produce anything is being wiped out by cheap Chinese imports. So I think there is a pushback to the idea that it is one happy family. China will produce everything. And I think a recent analysis have shown China's overall share of manufacturing in Asia has dramatically grown. So for Australia, which exports natural resources, that's fine. For Southeast Asia, which becomes a hinterland for China, that's fine. Japan is at a higher level, so they send machinery to China. They're in a good position. But I think India is saying, look, we want to set up our own manufacturing. We don't want to be an adjunct to the Chinese economy. And I think that is a major strategic decision, which breaks from the mantra of globalization is inevitable. Let's all just enjoy Chinese, centered economy. For Kishore, it's fine. I mean, for a small city state, which is doing intermediation between China and the rest of the world, that's fine. But for India, it's not going to work. But I think Kishore, dear friend of mine, and this simplification, US is all about security and stupid, China is all about economy and forward-looking. I think that's really a false dichotomy. The cumulative US investment in the region is much larger than that of China. And if we put together Japan and Europe, the West is a big force. I think just because China and the regional trade has grown does not mean there are no problems there within it. And I think we're beginning to see some pushback. And my sense is, at this point, yes, the US is going through an internal evaluation of its attitudes towards globalization. And US is not going to go back, irrespective of who wins the elections, that the US is going to come to a different form of globalization. And within that, I think we've heard Kurt Campbell and others talk about, they are going to come up with economic initiatives to deal with the region. But if meanwhile, if ASEAN says, look, we just simply trade with China, which is irrespective of the terms of the trade, nobody can stop them. But I don't think India will accept that or the US is going to accept that.
Here's an interesting factoid. The Philippines is quite unusual among Southeast Asian nations because it actually does more trade with Japan and America than China. And The Economist magazine pointed out recently that Japan's actually a bigger investor in infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia than China. We don't hear nearly as much about that. Let's turn to two of the balancing coalitions against China that have got the most attention in the media and elsewhere. Raja, the quadrilateral security dialogue that brings together India, Japan, the US and Australia, was revived in 2017 under the Trump administration. China immediately dismissed it as foam on the sea that gets attention but will soon dissipate. Well, it hasn't dissipated, but the original focus on maritime security has. Now just about everything except security seems to be on the Quad agenda. Does this risk being busy without being effective? Why the change in focus, do you think?
Look, first, I think, we shouldn't take every rubbish that the Chinese papers write too seriously. And I think there's been this tradition in the West last 40 years. We debate on terms set by the Chinese. And here is a massive state propaganda machine that churns out rubbish. And as a former leftist, I can see propaganda. I can read it when I see it. But much of the China scholarship in the West, in Australia and Japan, treat it like somehow it's Bible being said and that we must take that literally. Look, Chinese do things and say things and they change their mind if it suits them. But I don't think we need to debate in their terms. I think the decision to move the Quad from a narrowly focused security institution, which is how it was initially conceived under the Trump administration, to one which has a broader agenda, from vaccines to supply chains to technology, I think is a good move. Partly to reassure our friends in ASEAN, oh my God, there is another military alliance out here. So, which is the kind of propaganda Chinese does. Chinese do. So I think one reason is that. Second, I think if you look at what the countries are doing, that's far more consequential. There is growing India-US defense cooperation. There's growing Australia-Japan defense cooperation. There are new institutions being created. There's greater intelligence exchange. So just because we don't call it a security institution does not mean the four countries are not doing security actions. So my sense is I don't think we should go by what is being said, but I think go by what they're doing. And there's a lot of security stuff happening between them. But I think having the Quad approach the ASEAN, look, we're a non-military organization. We want to engage you. Each country individually, bilaterally. I think it's a good move. Meanwhile, AUKUS and other formats are going to take up the military activity, which I think is good.
Well, speaking of AUKUS, Renato, as Raja said, that has much more of a security focus, the pact between the US, the UK and Australia, with that very awkward acronym, unfortunately, AUKUS. And the news that Australia will acquire nuclear-propelled submarines, which made waves throughout the region. Now, the Philippines was really quick off the mark to welcome the deal, and the government issued a very clear-eyed statement of support, I think only 4 days after the AUKUS announcement. Tell us a bit more about this response. why would AUKUS benefit the Philippines?
Well, as mentioned by Foreign Secretary Teodoro Locsin, the United States is very far. It's out across the Pacific. We need a country that is near. And of course, he was referring to Australia. In his speech delivered into the Lowy Institute, he even mentioned that Australia is actually part of the southern flank of ASEAN, basically providing that military protection capability that ASEAN is simply not capable of developing. For one thing, of course, we have to take into account, ASEAN is divided. The weakness of ASEAN stems from its division. The fact that you have the continental Southeast Asian countries that have basically adopted, a bandwagoning policy vis-a-vis China versus the maritime. That's why, in a way, ASEAN is kind of insecure with Quad, given the fact that its weakness vis-a-vis ASEAN. China has effectively divided ASEAN since 2012. 2000, when Cambodia was, of course, the chair of ASEAN, and ASEAN was not able to come out with any, the chairman's communique on the South, that, of course, has statements regarding the South China Sea dispute. So the Philippines took that position, for us, given the fact that, ASEAN has no military capability to challenge China and the United States is across the Pacific, we could only rely, of course, on Australia as constituting the southern flank ASEAN. You mentioned it.
Now, the submarines won't come online for at least 20 years, if they ever do, according to some sceptics in Canberra. But nonetheless, Raja, Canberra's decision to cancel that French submarine contract in favour of AUKUS led to a really serious diplomatic split with Paris, which is also a defence partner to India. So can India and perhaps even Japan act as a kind of mediator with France to keep it engaged in a regional coalition to balance China, because France has Pacific interests?
I think, the French reaction was really, quite angry, and you can understand that. The French are major partners for India on the security side. So is Australia and the US today. So India does not want its friends to fight. And given the scale of the challenge we face from China, ideally we should not be squabbling amongst ourselves. But my sense is once the French are realists above all, and once the current elections are over, hopefully there will be new ways of working together. And I'm sure that'll eventually, there are ways in which I think Australia and France do not need Indian mediation. I think I'm sure they can find ways to sort things out once we are past this elections, both elections in both the countries. But my sense is over the longer term, look, we tried India, Australia, France as a trilateral grouping. That unfortunately didn't work out because of the French have pulled out. But my sense is there is a lot of room still for three of us to work together. So in the days ahead, for example, in Southern Indian Ocean, where French have territory, the Réunion Island, or in the South Pacific and other places. So there is a lot we can work together. And my sense is over the years that can still be done. But once France gets over its current anger at what has happened.
The other big criticism of AUKUS, which has had a very mixed reaction in Australia as well, actually, is that Canberra is effectively turning its back on Asia. It's indulging in a sentimental dream about the Anglosphere coming to the rescue. So how did the optics of the Anglosphere and AUKUS go down in Delhi, which sees it as a bit of a colonial construct?
Look, I think, in democracies, you use any argument to beat your opponents. But this is a very simplistic divide between Anglosphere, colonial versus Asia, anti-colonial, and suddenly Australia is part of the great anti-colonial world. Look, this again, is really a misrepresentation of the complex history of Asia and its interaction with the West. Look, if we go back to the last 100 years of Asia, Asians always talked about Asian unity, but they could never really agree on who was the problem. Right? If you go back to the First World War, while everyone was against the colonials, Indian, including Mahatma Gandhi, supported the British. If you come to the Second World War, a lot of people of some countries in Asia were fighting the Japanese, some countries were fighting the British, some were fighting the French. And this idea, which Japan used in the interwar period, Asia for Asians, as a way of, justifying its occupation of the region. China today uses the same argument. We're all Asians. Look at this outsider. Oh, but for the Americans, US, China, and Philippines, tomorrow they can sort out the Philippines issue, as if there are no issues between the Asians. So I think, look, when you're in trouble, you look for friends. My sense is, for India today, whatever the past views of India were, putting the West back into the equation in Asia is critical for balancing China.
It widens everyone's options, yeah. Renato, over to you. Building and sustaining a coalition is very difficult at the best of times. And I think one advantage that China has is that it can move really quickly and with great purpose as a single unified actor. Coalition members have to consult and coordinate. And another advantage it has is that it's much easier to break up a group that's forming against it than to build a coalition. Here's Elbridge Colby, who's a past guest at CIS. He's the author of a new book called The Strategy of Denial, American Defence in an Age of Great Power Conflict. And he's writing in The Australian, and he says, Critical to the success of any such coalition is its ability to stand up to China's own strategy. That's likely to be a focused and sequential strategy designed to pick off enough vulnerable members of that coalition to cause a run on the bank of the coalition's and especially America's credibility. Fearing they will be left exposed to China's ire without sufficient backing, coalition members will start to cut deals with Beijing. The result, China will be able to dominate Asia without fighting a massive war it's got plenty of reasons to avoid. And he talks a bit about Philippines in the book in quite a few chapters. Respond. What do you think of that scenario? Plausible?
Yeah, that's possible if, China would play it before Xi Jinping. But it's a totally different picture now when you have Xi Jinping consolidating the party and, of course, the hubris that had developed within the Communist Party of China. The Chinese have developed this capability. We are so powerful. We are so sly. We can do everything that we can. So at a certain point, it could antagonize even countries that China has already succeeded in turning around, like the Philippines. Take the case of the Philippines under President Duterte. They had it already, the Philippines was already underhand in 2016. But then, they thought that, simply because they controlled Duterte, they have the entire Philippine nation. But first, China failed to deliver its promise of goodies to build the program of the Philippine government. Second, of course, is the behavior of the People's Liberation Army's Navy in the South China Sea. So despite the fact that they already captured the top position in the Philippine government, they mess it up. So this is something that's also what happened with China. They thought they have everything under their control. But then, of course, they realized that, they could make mistakes. This notion of hubris, they think they have that, they're so powerful. They even thought they could basically challenge, the virus, prevent zero COVID in China.
Let's return to the maritime domain for a moment. There's a question here from one of our viewers, Bruce McKern. And the question is for Roger, I think. It's about India, but feel free to jump in, Renato. Does India see China's efforts to establish commercial ports and naval bases to protect its maritime supply routes via the Indian Ocean as a serious threat? Likewise, its creation of a road and rail route around India via Pakistan.
Look, I think China is a great trading nation. Like all the great trading nations before, is going to build a powerful navy and to operate a powerful navy that can protect its global interests. It is going to seek bases. It already has one in Djibouti. And there's a lot of speculation on where the next base might be. Let's talk about Cambodia, of course, in the east. They probably in another African country or Pakistan, they already have a very good relationship. So my sense is, look, it's a logical consequence. As China's power rises, given its expansive trade, it is going to create a global network of military facilities, access arrangements. Of course, that's going to be a challenge to India. So for us, I think the question is, it's not a question of saying, are they going to do it or not? They are doing it. Just like Britain, France, Portugal before them, they're going to do it. Now, the question is, what are we going to do about it? That is the issue. There, I think the need to work with others to create infrastructure in the region, to offer an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, where we can give better terms to Asian countries or the Indo-Pacific countries. That is the key. Merely saying Chinese are bad means nothing. So I think we need to get our act together individually. I see Australia doing a lot in the Pacific Islands these days on underwater, cables, a whole lot of new initiatives. India is trying to do things in South Asia. So I think we all need to, we are going to respond. I think it's no question of, it is going to happen. And the question is, what are we going to do about it?
Oh, Renato, you might want to jump in on that point, but China has legitimate interest in defending and protecting its supply lines and its trade routes. But the kind of navy that it's developing and the naval build-up over the past 20 years looks very different to kind of navy you need to perform those functions. aircraft carriers, submarines, they're not generally associated with protecting sea lions. What do you make of that, Renato? Is that an offensive capability, not a defensive one?
An offensive capability. They have reproduced, they have translated Alfred Thayer Mohan on sea power in China. It's also being read. They're following the trajectory of the United States. First, building up the Navy to control the first island chain, the same way as the United States was able to control the Caribbean at the beginning of the 20th century, then slowly, of course, building a Navy that could be projected elsewhere. Of course, the big question here is Chinese software. China doesn't have a naval tradition. Of course, it had built ships, but China simply doesn't have any experience in naval warfare. So the test will be actual neighbor, not just competition, but the naval clash to see whether China has what it takes to become a naval power like the United States in the 20th century, or Great Britain in the 19th century, or Japan, even Japan in the 20th century. So we're all kind of mesmerized with China's building up a Navy, but that Navy doesn't simply have a spirit. So that remains to be tested.
Let's move on to India. There's and the Russia connection, which I think is going to keep popping up and haunting India to a certain degree, Raja. I mean, India's relations with Russia go back a long way. They had a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Now, today, Russia is India's largest defence supplier. And despite this, Washington and Delhi have drawn closer in recent decades because of the China concern, which is a shared concern. At the same time, Russia's relations with the US have gone from bad to worse, and Russia's relationship with China has never been closer. Surely this has complicated India's foreign policy, or is India trying to play one off against the other?
No. Maybe we used to play one off against the other in the Cold War, in the early Cold War years in the name of non-alignment. But today, look, there are contradictions. Every country has to manage those contradictions of the real world. And I think India has a legacy relationship with Russia, and it's simply not going to abandon that relationship, depending on what happens between Moscow and Washington or Moscow and Beijing. Because, we were told, Russia relationship is bad. But if you go back to the 90s, Americans were saying, look, Russia is kosher. Everyone was saying Boris Johnson is a great guy. So tomorrow, if they do a deal in Geneva, we're seeing they're talking again. Does that mean I simply jump every time the US relationship with Russia changes? So I think that's one part. So I think large countries maintain a balanced relationship, and I think that's what India is doing. Second, I think Russia is no longer the major defense supplier to India. It still supplies a lot of equipment. But if you see the number of fighters, American aircraft that were flying on the border with China in the current crisis, they're all American aircraft.
What about the anti-aircraft systems that you bought off Russia that could make you eligible for US sanctions?
Just because eligible doesn't mean you get sanctions imposed. I mean, US is also not, a stupid country, that they have a relationship to build with India. They're not going to wreck it because India has bought one missile system. So I think the US is finding a way out. I think India is quite confident about it. So it's not but there's always those kind of issues will come up. But US and Russia too are talking to each other, because I think it's in US interest to pacify Russia, to get a deal in Europe so that US can focus on Asia rather than trying to fight on two fronts, because Russians, not easy to deal with. But my sense is that we got to deal with Russia as a force. We need Russian neutrality if we want to construct a system of balance against China. Whether we can get there or not, we should at least give it a decent shot.
We'll get back to the question of US strategic discipline and focus in a moment, but just a quick follow-up from somebody listening online. Anthony Carr says, to what extent does India's membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization conflict with the Quad?
Look, I think you shouldn't go by the form, you should see the substance. What has Shanghai Cooperation done? Anything? In the Kazakh crisis? It is the CST or it is the Russians who did it. And even the Chinese will stand as by. So India has got we join every club that's opened the door. So we wanted to make sure that China doesn't run away with Central Asia. So every time the SCO issues a statement on Belt and Road, endorsing it, The formulation is this. All the other countries minus India, mention each one by the name, endorse Belt and Road Initiative, but India does not. So I think just by sitting there doesn't mean anything. We also sit in the BRICS, we sit in the RICS. But if we see the scale of the expansion of India's relationship with the West today is far higher than what we do with the old Russian relationship. It's really, Russia's GDP today is only half of India's. So I think the India overall balance is changing. I think we sit in SCO. We want to keep in touch with the Central Asians and not abandon them to the Russians and the Chinese. So I think India plays its own game. I mean, just because we are an SCO doesn't mean we are camp followers of either Russia or China.
Let's turn to countries' domestic internal systems. Renato, a lot of the concern about China is about the increasingly authoritarian and repressive nature of its political system and the Chinese Communist Party's inbuilt hostility to liberal values. Do you think China is now trying to remake the world in its image as it leads reform of the global governance institutions and to make the world safer for democracy? I mean, for autocracy, I should say.
I think it's really more, I look at it more in terms of nationalism. You know, you have to explore the Chinese notion of the Asian dream that, you know, specifically focus in this part of the world, in our part of the world.
It's the China dream, isn't it?
Yes, the China dream, the Asian nightmare. I call it the Chinese dream, the Asian nightmare, that all problems have to be solved by Asians. And of course, China is referring to, it's the biggest and most powerful Asian country that will have a great say on how problems, issues here in Asia would have to be resolved, and that's nobody else but China. So this is a form of, you know, similar to what Japan did in the 1940s, the East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This is, of course, again, what the Chinese are selling to us. Whether China would try to export this notion of, you know, anti-liberal ideas elsewhere in Asia, of course, is another matter. I think the Chinese are also calculating. They are very much aware of their capabilities right now. They don't want to be like the Soviet Union during the Cold War, where, of course, the Soviet Union challenged the liberal capitalist order on a global scale. China's goal at this point in time is still focused on Asia, or let broaden it to the Indo-Pacific region. So I won't go that far. So at this point in time, this is my take. The goal is still to have the realization of President Xi Jinping's Chinese dream. I won't go that far, that it will try to unravel the liberal international order. The main arena is still the Indo-Pacific region.
And nationalism, let's remember, is one of the oldest ideologies in the world.
And this is, of course, China's convenient replacement to Marxist-Leninism. The core here is still Chinese nationalism.
Raja, I've got a question here from Anjali, which kind of picks up on this point about democracy, autocracy, because the Biden administration sees India as an important democratic counterweight against authoritarian China and Russia, for that matter. And India itself takes great pride in, as it should, in its credentials as the world's largest democracy. But there is growing concern in Washington and here in Australia about what Australian academic historian James Curran calls Prime Minister Modi's illiberal Hindu nationalism and the persecution of Muslims, which are India's largest minority. He says Modi has also undermined the independence of the judiciary and freedom of the press, and that this undermines the shared values rationale for India-Australia's bilateral relationship. So is the secular and liberal character of Indian democracy at risk?
Firstly, this argument, somehow India is illiberal, therefore it can't be part of the coalition. If China could be part of your coalition against communism, if communist China was part of the coalition against the Soviet Union, I mean, it's hard to believe for me that the US is going to build coalitions of the pure. So I think this idea in Asia that, forget India for a moment, there is Vietnam, is it going to be part of the coalition because it's communist? Or does it have problems with China, therefore it is part of the coalition? So I think there is this whole question of what is the weight that the US or anybody puts on the values question in relation to the larger aims that one pursues. There, I think it's always a trade-off And I don't see just one particular metric deciding what countries do. So that's one. Second, look, Indian democracy, those who write obituaries for the Indian democracy, just because Modi has been in power for 7 years, I think are fundamentally wrong, because it's like headline, running through, because there is an internal argument in India, how systems are working. There's abuse of state power. There are shrinking of certain freedoms. But that's an Indian internal argument that gets amplified as some kind of a fundamental collapse of the Indian democracy. It's not. In fact, other institutions like judiciary are beginning to assert themselves. And above all, I would say, India is about diversity. It's fundamentally about diversity. Religion is not the only line of conflict. We have caste. Is a bigger conflict. You're going to see these elections in Uttar Pradesh next few weeks, where almost more people than Europe are going to vote in that one state. There, BJP is losing ground. People are pushing back. So I think this idea that somehow India is finished, is no longer a democracy, I think is fundamentally wrong. I think India is a resilient internal structure rooted in its diversity, and politics is going to work this current issues. I think they will be worked out. So I'm quite confident Indian democracy is not going to die. It's premature to talk about it. And I think it has the capacity to, Modi will come and go. There'll be another guy who will come and go. But I think India has endured a lot more than some of the difficulties of the moment.
Renato, what about over in the Philippines? I mean, President Duterte has caused a lot of damage to democratic institutions and processes in the Philippines. His strongman approach to law and order, the extrajudicial killings, the attacks on the media, a lot of that's caused tensions with the US, especially over human rights. Now, is Raja right that Washington's prepared to overlook some of these things in terms of the broader interests of the Philippines returning to the US alliance fold, and therefore, Duterte got an invitation to the virtual summit of democracies?
Well, just look at the relationship between President Trump and President Duterte.
Yeah.
When President Trump went to Manila in 2017, he considered Rodrigo Duterte as one of his closest friends. Right? And he said, whatever you've been doing there, that's your problem. That's none of my concern. Well, even to a certain degree, the Biden administration took that position. We go back to the Cold War. During the time of President Marcos in 1981, when the late Vice President George P. Bush came to the Philippines and told Marcos then, we love your adherence to democratic values. So that's a point about democracy. You cannot look at democracy in its pure form. Of course, it has certain adjustments. It also have to play realpolitik. So that's the reality we have to face. Yes, as Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government.
Except for all the others, yes. We've got a question here in the chat box. You were talking about the China dream before and Xi Jinping. Andrew Humphreys asks, to what extent is Xi threatening the PRC itself by creating this cult of personality?
Yeah, it's basically unraveled, the communist system after Mao Zedong. He basically turned back then, like Deng Xiaoping did not exist. Collective leadership did not exist. But it has a different take. It's just Maoist China with the capability of a 21st century China. During that time, I could still remember in the 1960s, the threat was basically a revolutionary China led by a Mao Zedong. Now we have a Mao Zedong that has a China with what you call comprehensive capabilities that could basically ensure that the Chinese dream would be realized, and even, of course, challenge what we call the liberal democratic order. So that's the reality we face with China.
Roger, Xi Jinping. Sorry?
No, I just want to support the main point made by the question that by breaking the rules that was set by Deng Xiaoping for a more orderly succession, for better succession system, I think Xi Jinping has weakened China. There's no question. More you concentrate power around one leader, the weaker the system becomes. And I think for all the sense of the emperor, that he's in full charge of everything, I think that's really hides a lot more fragility internally. And I think this will be the biggest weakness of China, that it is too centralized, too concentrated power, I think, which Americans, I'm sure, will know how to exploit that.
Well, speaking of Americans, two things really, and I'll let you both jump in on this, but Xi Jinping says in numerous speeches, the East is rising, the West is declining. He is convinced that the United States is in terminal decline, and that is leading to overconfidence and potentially miscalculation. And on that question of US decline, I can give you a box set. I know that every 20 years this question comes up, but maybe this time is different. Maybe this time's different. Look at the state of American democracy. Washington's deeply polarised, the country's bitterly divided. Millions still believe the last election was stolen, and even middle-of-the-road think tanks like the Brookings Institution speculate that America could descend into civil war. And these are the guys we're counting on to stay committed to the region to help us deter China. So do you write America off?
I turned 60 last year. I'm old enough to remember those notions that the United States was about to decline. In 1969, when President Nixon declared the Nixon Doctrine, again, the United States was declining. With the fall of South Vietnam in 1975, the United States was declining. During the Carter administration, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and you have Nicaragua becoming socialist, the United States was declining. When the Cold War ended in 1991 and you had the Great Recession in the United States was declining. We have heard this rhetoric over and over again. Yet, for one reason or the another, the United States has this capability to come back on its feet. We cannot simply discount the capability of a liberal democracy to be able to recover from a major setback. Yeah, you have this division happening, but at the same time, the emergence of the Chinese threat is the only thing that probably could provide cohesion, could provide again a reason for the United States to maintain its superpower status, the same way as the Soviet Union provided this great power with a mission. So I won't go that far to say that the United States is about to decline, but just in case it will happen, that's where the other members of the Quad would have to ensure that, the stability in the region should be taken care of by countries who have the greatest stakes in the Indo-Pacific. And there, of course, I'm talking about India, Japan, and Australia.
Look, I think this slogan of East is rising, West is in decline. I think it is propaganda, but I hope the Chinese are smarter than believing in their own propaganda, this kind of nonsense. Because we heard the Soviet Union said this exactly the same thing in 1975.
No, it's Mao Zedong. It's Mao Zedong who said it.
Yeah. So I think this is, you don't underestimate your enemies, and if this is what Chinese are doing, I wouldn't be worried about it, and I'll be surprised if they actually believe in this propaganda for the rest of the world.
Do you think this is aimed at a domestic audience to mobilise them and to make them believe that only through the Chinese Communist Party can the people of China realise the Chinese dream and the great, rejuvenation of the Chinese nation? So it's aimed more at a domestic audience.
No, I think it's meant for the domestic audience. But look, anyone who has seen the world history last week, you can't sell this line for long. You'll have problems. And to deal with this internally, you simply say how great we are, I'm going to make you great. It takes you some distance, but after some point, there are other issues that come in. And externally, look, this is not just between China and the West. There are contradictions within Asia. And I think much of this debate ignores the deep contradictions within Asia, between China and Japan, between China and India, and a whole lot of other contradictions. So this simply to subsume all this as if the West is creating problems. That there are territorial disputes between us. Those are not created by America. Those exist. So therefore, China can't reconcile with its neighbors. That itself will create problems, whether the Americans come to defend us or not. Chinese nationalism is not the only nationalism in Asia. There are other nationalisms. They will stand up and fight against the Chinese hegemony.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, professors. I think we've run out of time. Let me thank you on behalf of the Centre for Independent Studies. We've had a really wide-ranging and enriching discussion today. Thank you for your time, and I hope that we can meet one day in normal circumstances, whatever that's going to look like after this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
For decades, the CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound classical liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.